My name is Callie Bregman. I'm 33 years old, and 5 weeks ago, my brother Ethan stood up at my mother's memorial reception in front of nearly 90 people and said I was basically a stranger for most of Mom's illness, showing up when it was convenient. He didn't know that my name was on every single page of the document that had kept our mother alive, comfortable, and in control of her own care for the last 2 years of her life. I found out he'd said it because 4 different people told me separately, in the receiving line, with the particular gentleness people use when they're about to repeat something cruel. To understand why I didn't cause a scene right there in that church hall, you need to go back 2 years, to the week my mother first asked me, and not Ethan, to sit with her lawyer. Before I get into that, if you're new here, hit subscribe. It helps this channel more than you'd think. Drop the word invisible in the comments if you've ever been the one who did the real work while someone else got the credit for showing up. I read every comment, I promise. Now let me take you back to where this actually started. I've been a registered nurse for 11 years, the last 6 of them specializing in hospice and palliative care at Ridgeline Regional Medical Center. It's not a job people usually ask follow-up questions about at parties. Most conversations stop after, "Oh, that must be hard," and move on to something lighter. I understand why. Nobody wants to think too long about the work I actually do, which is sitting with families at the end of things, translating what doctors say into what it actually means, and helping people make decisions they never wanted to have to make. I've held the hands of strangers in their final hours more times than I can count, and gone home afterward and made dinner and lived an ordinary evening, because that's what the job asks of you, to hold the weight and then set it down enough to keep functioning. I mention my job now because it's the reason my mother, Diane, trusted me the way she did, and the reason my brother resented that trust without ever quite saying so out loud. 2 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, stage C, the kind that doesn't kill you quickly, but changes the shape of every year you have left. She called me the week of her diagnosis, not Ethan, and asked me to come with her to see an estate attorney named Robert Kessler, to set up what's called an advance healthcare directive, a legal document that names who's authorized to make medical decisions on your behalf, if you can't make them yourself, and spells out exactly what kind of care you do and don't want. I asked her gently if she wanted Ethan there too, since he was older and I didn't want this to look like I was pushing him out of anything. She said something I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "Callie, I love your brother, but when things get hard, you're the one who stays in the room. I need someone who's proven that, not someone I hope will." We sat in Robert Kessler's office for 2 hours, the kind of small, book-lined office that smells faintly of coffee and old paper, with a window overlooking the parking lot where I'd end up sitting in my car afterward for a few extra minutes, not crying exactly, just absorbing the weight of what we'd just done. My mother named me as her healthcare power of attorney, the person legally authorized to make medical decisions for her if she couldn't make them herself, and listed specific wishes about resuscitation, about hospice timing, about which hospital she wanted to be treated at. My name is on every page of that document, initialed in the margins, notarized, filed with Ridgeline's Patient Records Department and with her cardiologist's office. Ethan's name appears exactly once, as a secondary contact, listed below mine. I didn't tell Ethan about the specifics. My mother asked me not to, not because it was a secret exactly, but because she said, and I remember this precisely, "I don't want this to turn into a competition about who loves me more. I just need it to be clear medically who has the authority, so nobody has to argue about it later." I respected that. I think, looking back, it might have been the one mistake I made in all of this, not because I did anything wrong, but because silence, even well-intentioned silence, leaves room for other people to fill in their own story. Growing up, Ethan and I had a fairly ordinary sibling dynamic, or at least I thought so at the time. He's 3 years older, was the louder one at family gatherings, the one who told stories that made the table laugh, while I was the quieter kid who read in the corner and, according to my mother, worried about things a 10-year-old shouldn't worry about. When our father left when I was 12, Ethan handled it by getting angry loudly in ways that got attention, and I handled it by getting quietly competent, doing the grocery shopping when Mom worked doubles, learning to manage her medication schedule when she had her first minor heart scare in her 50s, years before the real diagnosis came. Nobody assigned me that role. I just noticed what needed doing and did it, the way some kids in single-parent households learn to. I don't say this to paint Ethan as a villain in our childhood. He wasn't. He was a normal teenager processing a hard thing the way normal teenagers do. But I think the pattern that started then, me handling the practical, unglamorous parts quietly, him processing loudly and visibly, never really changed. It just got bigger stakes as we got older. By the time our mother got sick, it wasn't a new dynamic. It was just the oldest one in our family, playing out with a diagnosis attached to it instead of a grocery list. For the next 2 years, I was at nearly every cardiology appointment, every hospital admission, every medication adjustment. I build a spreadsheet, I know. Some habits don't leave you tracking her fluid retention, her weight fluctuations, her ejection fraction numbers over time, because I wanted her cardiologist to have real data, not just she seems more tired lately. I drove 40 minutes each way, twice a week minimum, sometimes more during flare-ups. I learned the names of every nurse on her regular floor, because I'd worked alongside people like them for a decade and knew exactly what questions to ask. Ethan visited when he could. He lives 90 minutes away, has 2 young kids, and works long hours at a logistics company outside Dayton. I want to be fair to him, because I don't think he was lazy or cruel in any deliberate way. I think he was, in the specific way a lot of adult children are, uncomfortable with illness in a way that made him show up less and less as things got harder, and then uncomfortable with his own absence in a way that made him defensive whenever it came up. He'd call our mother once a week, sometimes twice, warm and funny on the phone, the way he'd always been, and I think in his own mind that made him present. It just wasn't the kind of present that shows up in a hospital room at 2 in the morning when someone's oxygen saturation drops. The last 8 months were harder. My mother was hospitalized 4 separate times. The first in November was a straightforward fluid overload. 3 days of Roman IV diuretics and careful monitoring. Nothing that felt like the beginning of an ending yet. The second in January scared me more, a bout of pneumonia that her weakened heart struggled to keep up with, 5 days in the hospital, 2 of them in a step-down unit where I sat in the vinyl recliner beside her bed doing the kind of half sleeping I'd done professionally for a decade, but had never quite gotten used to doing for someone I loved. Ethan visited once during that admission for about 40 minutes, brought flowers the nursing staff had to find a vase for, and left before the doctor's evening rounds. In March, during the 3rd admission, her kidney function declined sharply enough that her cardiologist and the hospital's palliative care team wanted a family meeting to discuss goals of care, how aggressive to be with future interventions, whether to consider hospice, what she'd actually want if her heart stopped in a moment nobody could plan for. I called Ethan myself to make sure he was there. He came. It was, I think, the last time the 2 of us were in a room together that didn't end in some version of what happened at the memorial. The meeting happened in a small consultation room down the hall from her unit, the kind with a box of tissues on the table that everyone pretends not to notice until someone needs it. My mother was too weak that day to fully participate, so it was myself, Ethan, Dr. Osai, a social worker named Priya Malhotra, and a nurse case manager, I recognized from working the same floor years earlier. In that meeting, Dr. Osai, a careful, kind man, asked to confirm who held healthcare power of attorney before the conversation could formally proceed, because certain decisions legally required my signature and not just my presence. I said it was me. Ethan's face did something I didn't fully understand until much later. A flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed over, like he was recalculating something in real time and didn't want anyone to see him do it. He didn't say anything in the meeting. He asked me about it afterward, in the hospital parking garage, his voice careful in a way that felt more hurt than angry. When did that happen, the POA thing? I told him the truth 2 years ago when she was first diagnosed. She wanted someone who could be there for the day-to-day medical decisions. He said, and you didn't think to tell me. I said, she asked me not to make it a thing. I think she just wanted it settled without turning it into a competition. He didn't say much else that day. I thought, honestly, that we'd landed somewhere okay, if not fully resolved. I was wrong about that, in a way I wouldn't understand until the memorial. The fourth admission came in May, and it was the one where hospice first entered the conversation seriously, not as a hypothetical, but as a near-term decision. I remember sitting with Priya, the social worker, going through hospice intake paperwork while my mother dozed in the next room, and thinking how strange it was that I'd guided other families through this exact conversation dozens of times in my career, and still felt completely unprepared to do it for my own mother. I called my supervisor and used 2 of my remaining vacation days that week, not because I needed rest, but because I needed to be fully present and not split between 2 hospital floors. My mother passed away 7 weeks ago at home in hospice care, exactly the way she'd specified in that document 2 years earlier. No aggressive resuscitation, comfort, focused, surrounded by people she chose. I was with her. Ethan was there too, for the final 2 days, and I want to say clearly that I was glad he was, and that those 2 days, difficult as they were, felt like something close to peace between us. He held her hand through most of the second night. I remember being grateful for that, actually grateful, watching him finally be present in the way I think he'd wanted to be all along and hadn't known how. The memorial reception happened 12 days later, at the same church hall where she'd volunteered for 2 decades, running the Tuesday food pantry and, for a while, teaching a watercolor class to retirees who mostly came for the company. Nearly 90 people came, old coworkers, neighbors, women from her book club, cousins I hadn't seen in years, a few of her former hospice nurses who'd asked, quietly, if it would be strange for them to attend. I told them it wouldn't. I was glad they came. I spent most of the reception doing what I've always done at these things, refilling coffee urns, making sure the caterer had what she needed, checking in on my mother's oldest friend, a woman named Sylvie who'd known her since they were both 23 and new to the city. I wasn't performing grief loudly. I was doing what needed doing, the same way I always had, and I think, looking back, that's exactly the picture Ethan was standing across the room, forming an entirely different story about. Ethan gave a speech, warm and genuinely moving for most of it, about her humor, her stubbornness, the way she made a house feel like a home wherever she lived. He talked about her famous Sunday pot roast, about the year she drove 11 hours alone to see him graduate from basic training, about a joke she used to tell at every holiday that nobody outside the family ever quite understood but that always made us laugh anyway. People were crying, in the good way grief sometimes lets you cry, remembering someone well. And then, near the end, he said something I think he'd been sitting with for months, since that parking garage conversation, without ever raising it with me directly. He said the last 2 years were hard on everyone, in different ways. Some of us were there for the big, visible moments, others of us. And here, according to the 4 people who told me separately, he looked briefly in my direction, were basically strangers for most of it, showing up when it was convenient and somehow ended up with all the legal authority anyway. I was standing near the coffee urn when he said it. Sylvie, my mother's old friend, told me later she'd nearly dropped her plate. My cousin Renata, who'd flown in from Denver, said she looked around the room to see if anyone else had caught it, and half the room had. I didn't confront him at the reception. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't Grace, exactly, or at least not only Grace. It was that I was standing in a room full of people grieving my mother, holding a coffee pot, and I didn't think that room needed to become the place where I defended 2 years of 4 a.m. phone calls and cardiology spreadsheets. I let it sit. I finished refilling the coffee, made sure the caterer got paid, and drove home that night and didn't sleep much. My coworker Danielle, another hospice nurse I'd worked alongside for 6 years, called me the next morning after Sylvie had apparently texted her, unprompted, still upset on my behalf. Danielle didn't tell me what to feel. She just said, "You don't have to decide right now what you're going to do with that. You're allowed to just be angry for a while before you figure out the rest." I think that permission mattered more than she realized. I'd spent so many years being the person who stayed calm and handled things that I'd almost forgotten it was allowed to just sit with being hurt, without immediately managing it into something productive. What changed things wasn't a confrontation I planned. It was a phone call 17 days after the memorial from Ridgeline's patient records office, informing me that my mother's estate attorney, Robert Kessler, had requested a copy of her advance directive and medical decision, making records for the estate proceedings, and that as her documented health care power of attorney, I was the party of record who needed to authorize the release. I called Robert back within the hour, mostly to make sure the timeline was accurate before it went into anything official, since I knew Ethan would eventually see the same paperwork and I didn't want there to be any ambiguity for him to push against later. Robert pulled up his own file while we talked. He confirmed the directive had been executed on October the 14th, 2 years and 1 month before my mother's passing, notarized in his office, filed with both his firm and with Ridgeline's records department within the same week. He read me the full list of documented medical decisions made under that authority over the 2 years, the March goals of care determination, the May hospice transition, and 11 smaller decisions in between, medication changes, a declined additional cardiac procedure my mother hadn't wanted, a home health aid authorization. Every single one had my signature and a timestamp beside it. Robert suggested a short joint call with Ethan to walk through the estate timeline together, mostly procedural, the kind of call that happens in every family settling an estate, nothing dramatic intended on his end. Ethan was on that estate call too, on a joint line with Robert. Robert, methodically and without any particular drama, read the timeline into the record for the estate file, the date my mother had established the directive, the name listed as primary health care agent throughout that entire period, and the log of major medical decisions authorized under that document, including the decision, 7 weeks earlier, to transition to home hospice care. I heard Ethan go quiet on the line in a way I recognized from the parking garage. It wasn't an angry quiet. It was the quiet of someone doing math they didn't want to be doing out loud, watching a story he'd told himself, and then told 90 people at a memorial, come apart against a timeline that had never actually been in dispute. It had just never been read out loud to him in full before. Robert asked, procedurally, if there were any questions about the record before he filed it. There was a pause long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Ethan said, "I have a question, not about the estate, about something I said at the memorial." I didn't answer right away. Robert, sensing this wasn't strictly business, said he'd give us the line for a few minutes and log off, and thanked us both for handling the estate matters so cleanly, which felt like an oddly ordinary thing to hear in the middle of what was about to happen. Ethan said, "I've been sitting with what I said for weeks. I think I said it because it was easier than admitting I wasn't the son I wanted to be for her, and it was easier to make it about paperwork than about the fact that I wasn't in that hospital room enough. I'm sorry, Callie. I don't know how to fix it. I just needed you to know I know. I sat with the phone against my ear for a moment before answering. I thought about the January pneumonia admission, the 40-minute visit with flowers the nurses had to find a vase for. I thought about 90 people at a memorial, 4 of whom had felt they needed to walk up to me afterward and tell me what my own brother had said about me. I didn't tell him it was fine. I don't think it was fine, and I think pretending otherwise would have done both of us a disservice. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and that I needed some time before I knew what came next between us. He said he understood, and that he wasn't asking me to fix it quickly. Just wanted me to know the apology was real, and not just about the estate call catching him out. That was 6 weeks ago. We've talked twice since then, careful, shorter conversations than we used to have, rebuilding something slowly instead of pretending the crack never happened. Last week he asked if he could come with me to visit her grave, which he'd never asked before. I said yes. We didn't talk much while we were there. I think that was fine too, in its own way. I think about that memorial sometimes, and about what it means that the truest account of those 2 years didn't come from either of us arguing our own case, but from a legal document my mother had quietly signed, initialed, and filed 2 years before she needed anyone to believe her. She always did trust paperwork more than arguments. I understand that a little better now than I used to. I've also thought a lot, these past few weeks, about why my mother chose me the way she did, back in Robert Kessler's office 2 years ago. I don't think it was because she loved Ethan less, or because she was keeping some kind of score between us the way I sometimes worried she might be. I think it was simpler than that. I think she'd watched both of her children for 30-some years, and had come to understand something true about each of us. That Ethan showed love loudly and inconsistently, and I showed it quietly and reliably, and when it came time to decide who should hold her life in their hands during the hardest moments, she chose reliability, not because it was more valuable than love, but because it was the thing she could actually count on at 2 in the morning. I don't think that makes Ethan's love for her any less real. I've come to believe, watching him these past weeks, that he loved her enormously and simply didn't know how to show up for the unglamorous parts of that love the way the moment required. I think a lot of people are like that, actually capable of real love that just doesn't know how to translate into a hospital parking garage at 11 at night, or a spreadsheet of ejection fraction numbers, or the particular exhaustion of learning every nurse's name on a cardiac floor. I don't say that to excuse what he said at the memorial. I say it because I think it's true, and because holding both things at once, that he hurt me, and that his grief was real too, has been the harder, more honest work of these past 6 weeks than simply being angry at him would have been. If you're watching this and you've ever done the hardest, most invisible kind of caregiving, the kind that doesn't show up in a toast or a speech, just in spreadsheets and 4 a.m. phone calls and years of quietly staying in the room, I want you to hear this. You don't need anyone's permission to know what you did. Sometimes the truth doesn't need you to raise your voice. It just needs someone, eventually, to actually check the record. And sometimes, if you're lucky the way I turned out to be, the people who got it wrong find their own way back to the truth too, even if it takes a stranger reading a timeline out loud on a conference call to get them there. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time you showed up for someone and nobody noticed. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a woman who spent a decade being called the difficult daughter, and the single voicemail that finally proved who was telling the truth.